Sometimes you just have to talk about stuff that doesn't really matter anymore. Stuff that's past the pall of relevance, but it kind of just sticks in your craw a little bit, or maybe you have a particular personal interest in it and you just have to indulge it. Otherwise, you'll lose your mind. And that's what I'm doing today. Let's talk Vaporwave. We all know about Vaporwave at this point. It's been like a decade since it came into being and rose out of the underground. Or, maybe more accurately, we know of the shadow that the genre has cast. The imagery, the musical approaches, aesthetic sensibilities, and ethos of Vaporwave have implications far beyond the scope of the genre. It, along with the much more sincere chillwave, are the genre of relaxed, down-tempo, effect-treated electronic music, genres of music seemingly made to braid the frayed edges of millennials' damaged psyches, or to simply be the perfect accompaniment for studying or work. And for many millennials and those younger than them, the future remains a question, and childhood is an old snapshot in sepia tones. So who am I to blame the dreamy among us for immersing themselves in the smeared hues and cozy aesthetics of this style? While, for one, the pool of emotions it draws from is similar, though less precise than proper emo, and I love some good, proper emo. Bite me and bite me. Hell, I, myself, guilty as charged, took refuge in the relaxing vibes of lo-fi hip-hop and iced coffee when I was writing my final dissertation for college. It was effective, tuneful, soothing, you could even say aesthetic. Despite this, however, there is still an ocean of space between the Vaporwave landmark Chuck Person's Echo Jams Volume 1 and whatever lo-fi hip-hop radio on YouTube you may choose to frequent. What connects these things, if anything? To this point, the aesthetic is the primary point that Vaporwave is, was, and probably will forever be sold by. Aesthetic is just a word, though. Everything has an aesthetic, but only select things have the aesthetic in question. And while we're on the subject, in terms of introducing academic language into the popular lexicon, aesthetic is a word that Vaporwave did more to bring to public consciousness than almost anything else. But what is the aesthetic? It's a question that you really have to approach from a number of different angles, I think. Firstly, I think we should lay some groundwork, defining what we mean when we talk about aesthetics. According to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, aesthetics is a branch of philosophy dealing with the nature of beauty, art, and taste, and with the creation and appreciation of beauty. It's also defined as a particular theory or conception of beauty or art. From a musical perspective, the aesthetics of Vaporwave are obvious, or at least they're roughly self-apparent. There's a bedrock of sampling music from the 1980s and 90s, usually the sorts of offerings of the time like smooth jazz, new age, world music, adult contemporary, elevator music, early electronica, and smooth R&B, among other things. These samples are then usually modified in all sorts of different ways, chopped and screwed, twisted, and treated with effects like reverb, pitch shifting, echo, flanger, and looping to achieve a hazy, dreamy, and somewhat disorienting final product. The musical aesthetic of Vaporwave, in short, is taking corny old music from the 80s and early 90s and severely messing it up to create a dreamy effect, maintaining the essential form and harmonic qualities of the original composition, but shrouding it in a layer of distance to remove any sense of immediacy or familiarity from it. Even songs you know won't sound like the songs that you know. And this furthermore gives the songs a nearly trippy ambience that's completely distinct from the original recordings of the songs they are sampling. And like many other genres of music, Vaporwave is not a purely musical aesthetic. It has a strong visual component to it as well. The visual aesthetic of Vaporwave also borrows from the 80s and 90s, particularly focusing on early 3D renders, epochal corporate aesthetics, quasi-futurist visuals, and cyberpunk, which, promise me, is its own can of worms that I'll try to at least address a little bit. These visuals are often treated with compression artifacting, blurring effects, and filters to reach a similar emotional end as the music, to leave it shrouded and dreamlike. In some cases, particularly in the case of the aforementioned early 3D renders, they are left untreated because the visuals in question are already so surreal and bizarre that the dreamlike quality does not need to be achieved through modification. It's already there. Through this cursory and not at all exhaustive examination of the basic aesthetics of Vaporwave, we can see the preoccupations of the genre are rooted firmly in the past. More particularly of a time in the global north where computer technologies began to integrate themselves into the daily lives of people. From their nearly exclusive early utilizations within corporate or business settings to the creation of early home computers in the 80s and 90s, to the point when home computers evolved from a novelty niche interest to a veritable consumer product for the masses. To say only that Vaporwave is focused on the past is kind of a truism, but to say that it's focused on the past of when the computer came into popular usage makes a lot more sense of the genre. Why corporate aesthetics? They were among the earliest adopters of computer technology, mostly to ameliorate the problems of logistics at the office. Why old school quasi-futurism? They were emblems of the era of early computers that suggested futures that were possible with this technology in tow. Why early computer art and visuals? Do I even have to explain that last one? But it's not enough to simply regard Vaporwave as suggesting the past. To understand it, it should be understood that it is expressly nostalgic as well. And to that, another eye-rolling "of course" from the audience. But this is something that is bolstered by the musical and visual aesthetic of the genre as well. Everything is dreamy and shrouded and maybe even ghostly sometimes, suggesting not just a memory of the past but an active, working recollection of it. These are visuals that themselves suggest nostalgia without the necessary precondition of having experienced it. The things feel like memories even upon first experience of them. This is why you can find a good deal of sensucht among Vaporwave and its adjacent circles, pining comments to the tune of evoking nostalgia for a time or an experience an individual never actually lived. They may not themselves have experienced the origin of the aesthetics being evoked, but they can remain evocative unto themselves. The aesthetic, in short, is to create a lens in the present to recall the past through a dreamlike shroud. This is, in my opinion, the common ground of lo-fi hip-hop, New Dreams Limited, and muted, specifically contextualized remixes of pop songs from the 2000s. However, don't be misled into thinking that Vaporwave is merely an engine for nostalgic rumination. As I see it, that's a budget interpretation that people have settled on, and one that may even have its own merits. But there's an important aspect to uphold about Vaporwave that people more and more so overlook nowadays. This grows ever more true as the sad-eyed, wistful strains of the aesthetic bleed into the larger culture in the decades since its inception. But we have to remember the message. We have to remember what these aesthetics mean and what they're trying to tell us. That is, of course, to make Vaporwave anti-capitalist again. Part 2. Colonialism and Cultural Fetishization. Alright, let's talk for a minute about New Age music. I brought up New Age styled music as one of the plundered genres that makes up the tapestry of Vaporwave. It is, or was, a genre that often evokes the narrative of peace being achieved through a return to innocence. And this premise is often expressed through an appropriation of the music of indigenous people. In this way, New Age music is a manifestation of a bourgeois liberalism, where the other is able to be fetishized as a distant innocent, whose culture can be consumed and understood within the framework of appropriated and recontextualized art. New Age music was commonly made and packaged for well-to-do liberal elites, often of the business class. People who, despite their wealth, harbor many of the same feelings of alienation intrinsic to capitalism that people of a lower class deal with. The difference, of course, being that these are people who were given wealth, privilege, and success by the same system of alienation, so they're not going to question the invisible hand that's always fed them. So they go seeking out another narrative, a narrative that sounds something like this. Modern life is difficult, full of rigor and stress, and a lingering hollowness. But it's just a function of our increasingly technologically integrated world. There's a beauty in the simplicity of less advanced people who can enjoy their lives free of the stress of the hyper-modernized world. This narrative can seem initially appealing, but it is nonetheless sophistry. It presupposes any sort of ease to indigenous people's lives despite all of the evidence to the contrary. Issues of colonialism, environmental degradation, infractions of state governments upon their lived-in and ancestral land, and the forward march of surrounding civilization cutting off their ability to live the life they had lived for possibly hundreds, maybe thousands of years. It furthermore perpetuates the narrative of the noble savage, a racist archetype that is the very essence of a backhanded compliment, but directed towards an entire group of people with a history and culture that are often ignored or even destroyed. Within the understanding posited by New Age, indigenous primitivism is fetishized on a purely abstract and hypothetical level. Well-to-do liberal adherents of the New Age philosophy may attach signifiers of indigenous lifestyles or cultures to themselves, but it is their work, the world that they live in, that is the thing that undermines the ability of indigenous people to actually exist. This is sort of the fundamental contradiction of New Age music that exists at the heart of it and tears it apart from within. Well, that and the utter disrespect they show to the rights of the performers of that indigenous music that gets sampled and recontextualized within the genre, most of the music's performers going completely uncredited, unnamed, and unknown because I suppose they don't care about that sort of thing in their culture. So that weirdos with bad shorts and a tape recorder can make bank stealing this music and then selling it as a grift to well-to-do liberals with a lingering hollowness in their hyper-modern lives. I don't know. Whole thing seems sort of fucked to me. But what do I know? All that aside, however, New Age music shares temporal space with the growth of computer technologies and their utilization within large businesses. The advance of these computer technologies and the growth and popularization of New Age music can feel like they're two distinct things that don't really have anything to do with each other at first. But really, this quasi-primitivist return to innocence narrative is something that makes a lot of sense as a liberal response to the alienation from labor that results from a rapid development of automation technology, such as computers. To be a person that is essentially comfortable in the material state of their lives, but to feel ever so slightly put off by how computers have begun to inch their way into your specialized place of employment. In this case, instead of placing onus on the owners of capital looking to maximize profit through automation, New Age depends on people couching this ennui in the technological growth in and of itself. This is a schema that is much more tangible to a regular petite bourgeoisie than finding some fundamental flaw in the economic system they are the primary benefactors of. Though I understand it can be hard to pin a definitive philosophy to a primarily instrumental, plunderphonic music made by a wide spread of different producers with presumably different philosophies and outlook, I like to think that there's a deep running vein in Vaporwave that satirizes this dichotomy. I personally like to look towards Internet Club's album Redefining the Workplace as a good piece of corporate satire from the Vaporwave camp. And more generally than that, the juxtaposition of nostalgic recollection, retrofuturism, and the technophobic liberalism of New Age makes for a total mess of aesthetics and philosophical positions. And while this mess can seem like a natural outcome of the chopped up nature of Vaporwave music, I like to think that this hodgepodge seeks to highlight the fundamental issues of trying to develop a philosophy to respond to and make sense of the irrationality and alienation of advanced capitalism. Without, of course, going into some Marxist analysis, which would actually make quite tidy work of a lot of this. But, we're not going to do that. Yay for capitalism. Yay for free markets. Woo. And furthermore, just as New Age music operates off of recontextual appropriation, Vaporwave as well does. Though in the case of Vaporwave, the power dynamics are entirely flipped, and the result is a copy of a copy, a photo negative of the original expression, a total inversion. Alright, while we're on the subject of colonialism, there's another elephant in the room I've yet to properly address with regards to this genre. Japan. Dong! That was my gong sound effect. It's funny. It's racist Orientalism. It's funny. It's funny! Damn it. Neon-colored Japanese cityscapes, Japanese language characters, and representations of old-school anime are all very common. And why? In short, Japan in the 1980s and 90s, and even into the 21st century to be honest, was the ultimate promise of technology's ability to improve civilization. They were the emblem of the future's promise. It wasn't always like this, though. Japan was historically isolated and heavily militarized into the 20th century, and were decimated by World War II at a level that even Germany could barely match. They were the ones that got the nukes dropped on them. But in the decades following the war, after a quite heavily coerced reformation of society and a pivot towards a Western capitalist system, the outside observer would not be wrong to think that the country was fast on track to being one of the leading tech development superpowers. In following the path of the free market, they were able to develop marketable technologies at a prodigious rate. Cars, VCRs, CDs, video game consoles, among many other things, all came from Japan. Furthermore, the West's amicable relationship with them in the 1950s and onward as a definitively capitalist state within the tumultuous East Asian region made them narratively and economically appealing. They were the barometer of progress in technology in the latter half of the 20th century, and it's not for nothing that the skyline of Tokyo around this time began to look something like futuristic during the 1980s. Japan was in a way the 1980s symbol of the future that technology could bring us to, which, if you've been paying attention, sounds in wordage suspiciously similar to something like retrofuturism. Vaporwave's utilization of Japanese characters, imagery, and aesthetics is an allusion to Japanese tech fetishism around the time their technological base was growing more and more powerful. East Asia, and Japan most particularly, around this time became the centering fixture behind the techno-futurism of the latter part of the 20th century. Because the future was defined by the mystifying otherness of Asian technology, there was also a fetishizing of them as the pavers of the road into the future that the West proper could enjoy. And you know how much the West likes East Asian people building infrastructure that they can use. Ha ha ha. This representation of Japan really binds together ideas of retrofuturism, colonialism, and the fetishizing of the other. It also captures this valorizing of technology as an instrument for the unerring growth of capitalism, and how much that contrasts with the New Age desire for simplicity and primitivism, and how both of these things are tied up with colonial misunderstandings of foreign peoples. Yay. And I just want to say there is clearly a lot of non-critical utilization of Japanese imagery and retro technology in service of the aesthetic in Vaporwave. But I also think there is a strain of poking holes in the narrative that Japan represented to the West at the time. A tendency towards undercutting the narrative of Japan as the paragon of development, capitalism, and computer technology at its very best and most effective. In juxtaposing this image of Japan as the future from the past of the 80s, there's an implicit reference to the imperfection and disappointment that technology has worked out to in the present. Virtual reality, digital social connectivity, cyberspace societies, artificial intelligence, video games, even the internet, all of these things, now existent in one way or another, have worked out to be letdowns from the high promises they made in the past. Just look at the harm that social media has wrought.
Oh, damn. Pew, pew, pew. Hot take, hot take. Pew, pew, pew.
Either way, it's inarguable that technology and computers didn't fix our lives or our civilization, and it could even be argued that they exacerbated certain existing problems in it, and the techno-utopianism of the past feels naive at this point, which, I guess, brings me to my next subject. Part 3. Anti-capitalism and utopianism. Vaporwave evokes a sort of nostalgia futurism, wherein the future as was understood in the past can be examined. However, this sort of nostalgia futurist utopian position is contingent on the non-existence of capitalist forces whose motives are profit-driven. The starry-eyed nostalgia the genre possesses positions the developments of technology as wonderful and imagination-spurning, but also implies the dark reality of the matter. We currently live in the timely future of technology predicted in the time Vaporwave's aesthetic and thematic framework emerges from, but we don't live in the world therein described or predicted. That's the source of disappointment and ennui. Earlier, when talking about the circumstances surrounding New Age music, I touched on the question of the answers people give to explain the disappointments in their life, both culturally and personally. The range of answers that people give can often make a lot of sense of their worldview. Is the great technology we were promised not realizing its fullest potential because of individuals? Is it capital? Maybe it's immigrants. Well, to cut the question short, it's the forces of capital. At least most of it. What's the thing that makes an extraneous marketable product or the 10th damn version of the same smartphone more valuable to make for a company than a genuine technological breakthrough? It's not immigrants, I'll tell you that much. Human invention is in the back seat, and while sometimes it gives directions, the driver calls the shots. And I think we all know who the driver is. Thinking about it, there's something perverse, almost dystopian about this couching of technological development in monetary gain and profit. It's as if this, the time we live in now, was never the dream of the future that was presented to the imaginations of people in the past. When we see the imagination inciting retro wire frame shell of an environment and imagine the potential this must have represented to people in the past, we don't imagine this technology having to be at the beck of capital, but alas, it, like everything, is. The potential henceforth is grounded by the unshifting edicts of the same economic model we've been forever bound to. In the face of a static reality and of politics that are scarcely different than those of the Reagan era, it was really the only thing that would make sense to happen. And this premise does find voice in the way that Vaporwave presents itself. In their piece, Attention Online Shoppers, writer Scott Beauchamp describes the music and emotional impact of Vaporwave as such, and I quote, Vaporwave's dreamy assemblages of smooth jazz, elevator music, lounge, and R&B, all distended and chopped and looped, might have the eerily ethereal texture of a dream. It's what the subconscious of a mall might sound like. It's the soundtrack to a hypnagogic reverie of a future that never happened. Furthermore, he says of Macintosh Plus's 2011 classic Floral Shop that, quote, it might sound like it's broadcasting the coordinates to the exact location where 20th century utopian aspirations collapse into a burned-out nostalgia. Woo! I love that quote. Good job, Scott. That's some good writing. Beauchamp sees Vaporwave as fixated on societal failure, and in my opinion, the genre's fixation on failure and the past are one and the same. The memory evoked by Vaporwave is, in a way, of a techno-utopianism, where the excesses of technology and capital are tempered by the growth of people's wisdoms about the role of technology in life. That or the technology itself would just pave a way to a more perfect future. It is grounded in the ideation that computer technology could be the building blocks to the architecture of a new, highly interconnected and more utopian world. A world where we could begin to be unfettered by boundaries and geography. Speaking literally, this is true, as the internet connects people across the entire planet. Infrastructural, technological, and economic restrictions on internet access aside, but it has done predictably nothing to amend the human relationships or the societies utilizing this technology. So this leads to situations like Facebook in Africa, being used to foment hatred and spread right-wing conspiratorial and untrue propaganda that gets people killed and also starts violent coups that overthrow democratically elected governments. And Mark Zuckerberg is complicit in this because he doesn't actually care enough to rigorously administrate Facebook in African countries to even the level of a small-time internet forum, because in his weird, twisted Caesarean mindset, Africa is just a colonized place and not something that he has to have any moral concern about, even if he has a lot of tacit power there. Alright, what I'm trying to get at here, what it boils down to, is that the forces of international capitalism have made the development of technology wholly in the direction of human well-being nearly impossible. Improvements to life made through technology happen, obviously, don't mistake me, but the utopian concept of technology serving the good of humanity is undercut by the reality that the corporations that develop and distribute and own this technology are necessarily motivated by profit. And that's a pretty severely limiting thing in terms of the growth of technology towards an expressly moral end. It all makes sense when you consider the tendencies of capitalism in the past. There was this amazing telecommunicative technology we came into with television and radio, but it got hijacked and brought to heel by marketing and advertising. This is not to pin the evils of the world on marketing alone, but rather to illustrate it as a symptom of money being the primary motivating force under capitalism, and not innovation or invention. There are similarities in what I'm describing here to the aforementioned cyberpunk. Cyberpunk was like the 1980s counterpoint to tech optimism. To sum up a very complex and multifaceted genre in a few inadequate words, it made the point to suggest that social ills such as wealth inequality, oppression, social decay, and alienation would not be mended by technological advancement, but would rather exacerbate these issues. Cyberpunk was also extremely Japan-centric. And what I mean by that is not necessarily by Japanese writers, but by Western writers writing about Japan. But like not real Japan, but like a Japan of the future. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier this is a real can of worms, right? A whole world of discussion about the othering of Japanese technology and culture exists in here, but it's too complex and tangential of an issue for me to dive into here with any respect. Aside from the aspect of the Western gaze that's present here, there's also the anti-utopian angle. If we want to talk about a reverie to a future that never happened, there's definitely a place for cyberpunk within that framework. It is the dark, shimmery, bleak iteration of a future from the past that suggests that human societal problems are not easily amendable, in contrast to the dream of tech utopianism that suggests that technology will make a lot of this all better. Cyberpunk also looks somewhat capital A aesthetic, or perhaps more accurately, Vaporwave borrows aesthetics from cyberpunk's legacy as another angle to retrofuturism from the time. This to me suggests a disquieting ambivalence to what Derrida would call the ontological shapes of these lost futures, whether they be utopian or dystopian. Note, I have not read Derrida. I don't care to. I just don't. I'm sorry. I don't know how to read, guys. I just don't. Due to this ambivalence, it can be hard to tell, even in a case-by-case basis, if Vaporwave is sincerely evoking the past tech optimism as a fond, if naive remnant of a bygone age, sarcastically chiding the naivete, or describing this version of the future as lost due to some element of social or economic failure that was left uncured. As Adam Harper writes in his fascinating examination of the politics of Vaporwave, quote, "These musicians can be read as sarcastic anti-capitalists, revealing the lies and slippages of modern techno-culture and its representations, or as its willing facilitators, shivering with delight upon each new wave of delicious sound." To the point of this idea of a lost future, we should also note Vaporwave's linguistic similarity to the concept of vaporware, a word describing a tech project that after being announced to the public never comes into being. As Harper's piece notes about this, quote, such is the deferred and even tragic promise of fulfillment in Vaporwave. On another note, the time that Vaporwave examines, furthermore, was a time of advertising approaching art status. I use that phrase art loosely and with some big scare quotes, as it can incite massive discourse unto itself, but the leaking of pop art into the marketing sphere created themes, visuals, and hooks that were memorable, striking, and immediate. Bold colors, memorable sound, fury, bombast, pathos, and rhetoric all became much more commonplace in advertising. And considering Vaporwave pulls from seemingly all of the dulled, naughty edges of popular culture from this time, it's only natural that advertising be included in this pool. And how inextricably bound up in capitalism and profit that marketing and advertising are just makes this all the more natural. It's myopic and reductive to imply that this is all used to the end of biting satire, but there certainly are cases of it. I love looking at the example of the video for St. Pepsi's Enjoy Yourself. The music is an optimistic, dreamy declaration of personal freedom about liberating oneself from the drudgery of the 9 to 5. This is nothing strange so far within pop music's individualist ethos, but the video is a chopped up and fuzzy old recording of a late 1980s McDonald's advertisement featuring the moon-faced lounge singer and not racist icon, Mac Tonight. For those who don't get that bit, Mac Tonight was turned into a racist meme by fascists and neo-Nazis called Moon Man. Don't look it up. It's stupid. It's dumb. This is the real Mac Tonight. We stand. This is an advertisement. I'm falling into the trap. Cut it. Mr. Tonight aside, the video is great, and I love it. It's not only that perfect level of fuzzy, unearthly surrealness to work as a vaporwave visual accompaniment practically on its own merits, it's also thematically just sardonic enough to merit attention. It positions the liberation posited in the song where, quote, there are no rules, it's up to you, within the context of a goddamn fast food commercial, which I think is a great sarcastic comment on the liberal conception of personal liberation being achieved through consumption and brand loyalty. You see, when marketing stands in for art, it holds the potential to stand in for all the things art is meant to express: liberation, emotional release, catharsis, humor, personal resonance, etc. It's usually not successful in that way, but there's no question that the act of marketing coming asymptotically closer and closer to the edge of art suggests that it's a motivation for marketers to at least reach for it. Even the name of this vaporwave artist, Saint Pepsi, suggests the elevation of a brand to the status of divinity. Now that's what I call some satirical shit. Probably. It's really not for nothing that vaporwave is often seen as corporate and marketing culture through a lens one part nostalgic and recollective and one part sarcastic and derisive. There's an element of kitsch here for sure, but there's something that's obviously weird about kitsch being harvested from the profit-motivated world of marketing, chiefly because though the contents of marketing have changed, the motivation of it has stayed much the same. This reflects vaporwave's preoccupation with some of the fundamental immutabilities of a capitalist economy. Just as we lived and continue to live in a world bound to the profit motive, we lived and continue to live in a world bound by marketing too. The recording artist behind vaporwave project Internet Club, Robin Burnett, commented on this point and their motivations for making the music they made by stating, quote, capitalistic society has generated a dehumanizing hyperreality by focusing on infinite generation of ideals as shown through commodities. The editing of the music is meant to achieve a defamiliarization of things we've become so used to that we don't notice them anymore. If it ever seems that the umbrella of aesthetic and philosophical stances taken in Vaporwave and its sister genre of hypnagogic pop is a somewhat inscrutable hodgepodge, well, part of that can be chalked up to the individual artist's initiative, but I feel a part of that should also be attributed to this infinite generation of ideals. When the solid ground of philosophical standpoint is eroded away to neoliberal consumerism, this infinite generation of ideals is necessary to keep people motivated towards an ever shifting goal. Whether that be New Age philosophy, marketing, business logistics, workplace fulfillment, or commodity fetishization, the modern world necessitates people be motivated by something that's immediately desirable but ultimately unreachable. Vaporwave seems to be focusing on the absurdity of these modes of consumption, advertising, and corporate culture as capable of producing any sort of art, specifically because they are primarily oriented to serve a marketing function. In reconfiguring these modes of cultural communication to become purely aesthetic, artistic, and entirely non marketable, the oddity of the entire culture comes into full florid light. The isolation of the aesthetic and ideological elements of popular culture renders them nearly absurd. Something did go a bit wrong in attempting this, however. And that brings me to my final subject. Part 4. The Sellout. You know, it's not for nothing that Vaporwave is scarcely understood. In all this time I've been talking, I still feel like I haven't quite gotten down to the roots of this. There's just so much to unpack here politically and philosophically, but in the end, for the musicians themselves, it's probably easier to just take some oddball lounge music from the 1980s, layer some effects on it, and call it a day. The inscrutability of the genre's philosophical stance left it a beguiling oddity to most people. In this respect, Vaporwave as an anti-capitalist project was doomed to fail. But it failed uniquely as well. It failed through selling out. It's impossible to deny that the dreamy and nostalgic, perhaps slightly melancholic feeling of Vaporwave made a much bigger splash than the more disquieting anti-capitalist sentiment that ran through it. Reverb, pitch shifting, and dreamy soundscapes are now synonymous with aesthetics. Those always present lo-fi hip-hop channels on YouTube borrow the 90s anime aesthetics and down-tempo music if almost nothing else from the genre. Washed out pastel pinks, purples, and blues and retro stylizations are forever tied to what Vaporwave was. I've even seen YouTube videos promote different sorts of wave micro genres that tend to focus on other various nostalgic niches such as Zelda wave and Simpsons wave. Don't mistake me, I may be a stick in the mud, but I don't necessarily hate this in and of itself. If we're talking from a standpoint of pure aesthetics and moody nostalgia, maybe there's a reason Simpsons Wave exists. Hell, I'll admit, Sunday School is an effective and evocative video, but the thing is, after everything we've talked about today, I think we can see that Vaporwave probably shouldn't be taken in a vacuum. To be uncritical of the place the aesthetic comes from is to be ignorant of the critique that seems to be present in the genre. In fact, I think it's not unfounded to say that the very idea of a nostalgia rooted in some kind of consumer identity, say in being a fan of the Legend of Zelda series, seems to be directly in contradiction to the point of the genre. The genre's pastiches and send-ups of new age, corporate, and marketing aesthetics in music seems to ridicule the idea that nostalgia experience vis-a-vis these sorts of sources is a true outgrowth of authentic human experience. It's a ghost of an experience manufactured in the service of capitalism, which is a huge point of the genre. A huge point of the genre that seems to be overlooked nowadays because, as musician Aaron David Ross says, quote, it initiates a lot of important conversations about power and money in the industry. Or everything just sounds good, slowed down with reverb? Based on contemporary perceptions of the genre, I'd say the latter of those 2 points stands as much more representative in the public eye. One need look only at the odd case of corporate brands utilizing, alright now, vapor-esque aesthetics. Vapor-esque aesthetics. Say that 5 times fast. You need only look at that to see the mess that's been made of all of this. Jordan Pearson of Vice writes of a time in 2015 when Tumblr and MTV both simultaneously adopted Vaporwave's visual trappings roughly 5 years following the genre's genesis. Quote, they have erased the cynical distance inherent in the digitally bred aesthetics they champion. The anti-corporate aesthetic goes corporate, and really, how couldn't it? It was just so damn cool and colorful looking, and the kitschy old technology thing is absolutely to die for. And the nostalgia. And this is all not helped by how much we just love the friggin' 80s. Whether we lived in it or not, whether we have any working memory of it, we just friggin' love the 80s. God, I hate the infinite regressive loop our culture is stuck in. Damn. Like, even if the 80s was cool and not the hell time of Reagan, AIDS, the crack epidemic, and hair metal, like, learn some new tricks. It's getting old. Okay, my own weird hang-ups aside, I don't want to get things twisted. I don't think the runoff from Vaporwave is 100% a problem. Hell, I like some of it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with feeling a bit misty about manufactured experiences like popular video games. I mean, damn, I spend plenty of time doing that shit. But to discard the critiques and problems with capitalism that this genre raises is to discard a meaningful part of what the genre is in favor of a fixation on pure aesthetics. And the fixation on pure aesthetics in the absence of an ideological groundwork is something that's kind of troubling. And I can't help but be reminded of the gradual and repeated combing of 90s punk until it was just a hollow facsimile of itself by the end of the decade. Vaporwave was never as immediate or in its face with your political sentiments. That made it intriguing, mysterious, and difficult to parse in a way that punk never was. But it also made it easily exploitable to marketers and aesthetes who saw the sentimental hues of its color palette but never saw past that veneer. Perhaps the genre's philosophical inscrutability is to blame. Or maybe pop culture nostalgia was simply too deep of a well to mine for Vaporwave to go untapped in the popular consciousness. Perhaps Vaporwave's criticism of nostalgia through replication was done too well, and fed directly into what critic Simon Reynolds called pop culture's addiction to its own past. Either way, the real slap to the face of all of this is that Vaporwave itself has become dated, a specter hanging around the edges of our culture, cropping up when we wouldn't expect it and ironically creating a new level of appetite for the past. Maybe it's not wrong to have an appetite for the past, but it's important to remain cognizant of the lens we're using to view that past, lest it all just become another consumer identity. That would really be the saddest insult to this genre you could ever muster.
Hello, it's DaLeetah here again. If you've stuck around to the end of the video and had the wherewithal to hang through all this, I appreciate it and I thank you. Or if you're just a weird enough person to just skip to the end gem of the video, it's a strange decision, but I respect it. I'm going to drop some links down there, both of the things sourced in this video and were direct inspirations of it, and also just some other stuff I found while doing editing for this video. I mean, truth told, just throw a stone in a search result for Vaporwave and you'll probably find some people writing some interesting stuff. There's a lot to dig into, so don't let this be an end jam. Don't let this be the end of the discourse. Let it be an ellipses, a comma, something like that. I don't know, punctuation. Anyway, also drop, like, share, subscribe, all the metric boosters. You know how it goes. I would really enjoy doing more essays like this, so greasing the cogs of that possibility would be super appreciated, and I would give you a kiss for it? Nah, I won't do that. That's weird. I will give you a cyber back pat. That seems good. And make it cyber because it is like 93 degrees in the room I'm recording right now. I don't want anyone to touch me. Get away. But also, like, hang out. You know? Yeah, you know. You're smart. I can tell because you're here and you're still listening to this. Anyway, enough of that. I hope you have a good month, week, day, hour, I don't know. Whatever span of time you really like. I like an hour and a half to 2 hours because it's just a real solid amount of time. You can get comfortable, but it's not too restrictive. You can watch a movie. That's cool. Most of them, not The Godfather, I guess, but you can watch a good amount of movies in that span of time. So I wish you a happy 90 minutes and a wonderful succession of 90 minutes henceforth. And you get enough of those and you got a good life, I think. Anyway, peace.